After the success of the initial 1990s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, a sequel was all but inevitable, really. And like any good multi-million-dollar idea, the moment it becomes clear that this thing is more than just a passing trend that the kids will be interested in for maybe a week or two, the urgency to pump out as much stuff with the brand's logo and faces on it become a top priority. That's why just under 18 months later, with brand merchandise starting its decline, we saw the release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2: Secret of the Ooze, a 1991 kids movie in every sense of the word. You see, there were some departures between the first movie and the second. Steve Barron, who was in charge of directing the last movie, was this time around replaced by Michael Pressman, a veteran in his field even at the time, who may not have directed very many movies, but had directed a ton of television. His highlights include The Bad News Bears in Breaking Training and an episode of the US adaptation of Life on Mars. While I have to applaud the scale of his filmography, he's also quite the producer too, I was left feeling that when compared to Barron's directing history, this was something of a step backwards. But I have been pleasantly surprised in the past, so I wasn't going to let this skew my judgment. Also leaving from the original, Bobby Herbeck, who'd worked very closely with Todd W. Langen, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird during the original movie to really try to nail the right tone between humour and dark action. Neither Bobby nor Todd have a tremendous amount of writing experience, but their teamwork in the original delivered a quite pleasant script. With Herbeck out of the picture and Eastman and Laird seemingly in a diminished capacity for this film, it's all pretty much on Langen here. I say Eastman and Laird are lesser involved in this film because, based on the direction that this film chooses to go in, neither of them would seemingly be happy with how this film turned out. But I'll explain why in a minute. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 picks up sometime shortly after the events of the first film. There's a bit of a discrepancy with exactly how much time has passed because on the one hand it's implied that the Turtles have been hiding out in April's apartment for a while, but then at the same time they also establish fairly early on that Shredder's literally only just been taken to the city dump. So it's either a very smelly dump truck and a couple of weeks, or the Turtles can get properly cozy in a place within a matter of hours. Either way, as mentioned, the Turtles are hiding out in April's apartment while they wait for the heat from the events of the first movie to die down. It's then very quickly revealed that Shredder survived his ordeal from the first movie, bearing in mind the guy was crushed by a dump truck. And he sets about rebuilding his ninja army. When a news report is broadcast covering the removal and disposal of toxic waste, Master Splinter decides that now is the time to tell Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello and Raphael that this same toxic substance is the stuff that made them the pizza-loving heroes in a half-shell that they are today. They're then sent on a mission to retrieve and destroy whatever ooze remains, only to find that the Foot Clan have beaten them to the disposal company, TGRI, and that the last vial of ooze has ended up in the hands of Shredder, who's kidnapped one of the research and disposal unit's top scientists and used him to genetically engineer two new mutants called Tokar and Razor to fight the Turtles. This doesn't quite go to plan, however, as these mutants are powerful but only have the minds of infants. Shredder manages to get them into a manageable position and even manages to kidnap Raphael, but the Turtles manage to rescue both him and the scientist, who begins to help the Turtles in defeating the new mutants. And thus a final battle between the Turtles and the mutants begins, with the Turtles maybe finally letting themselves in for way more than they bargained for. Had I, speaking solely for myself and not Kevin, been making the key creative decisions, it would have been very different. Among other things, there would likely have been no moronic henchmen, the Shredder would have been seriously malevolent, April wouldn't have been a reporter and constantly in need of being rescued by the Turtles, and the Turtles wouldn't have been so ridiculously obsessed with pizza. It wouldn't have had a joke or gag every 5 seconds. That quote's from Peter Laird talking in 2012 about his thoughts on the Ninja Turtles animated series, which came out a full 4 years before this movie was made. And this movie's quite literally the opposite of that quote in a nutshell. That is by no means to say that this is a bad movie, just that to me it feels like a major departure over the first film. Whereas the first film was more of an action kids movie with comedy elements, this film feels more like a young kids comedy with some action elements. It's considerably more in line with the cartoon series, something that both Eastman and Laird were pretty strongly against. There's been a shift in the target demographic somewhere along the lines, which I assume was due to the backlash from parents after the first film had excessive violence and use of ninja weaponry. Whereas the first movie was aiming to attract audiences of between 8 and 13 years old, this movie seems to be aiming for a 5 to 10-year-old market. And I feel it really suffers because of that. From even the opening minutes of the film, you know you're in for a different ride when compared to the first film. The first film opened with shots of New York as crime is rife, and it has a very natural and at least somewhat realistic feel to it. TMNT 2 opens in a similar way, only it's nighttime and literally everyone in New York is eating comedically big slices of pizza. Even the first appearance of the Turtles isn't quite as good as the original. The original had April being mugged by a gang when the Turtles knock out the power, beat up the bad guys and disappear in the blink of an eye. They're then teased through silhouettes and darkly lit shots, even off-screen overdubbing, before they're finally revealed as the Turtles. That teasing builds up audience expectation and gets people excited. In TMNT 2, well, they kind of heftily run into the shot out of focus behind another character and are seen for the first time lunging in a mid-air striking pose. It's not the worst way they could have reintroduced the characters to the audience, but it just says something completely different to the viewer against what was seen in the first film. Whereas the first film at least tries to acknowledge their ninja-iness, this movie just's like 5 minutes in, boom, Turtles in full daylight screaming, shouting and beating the crap out of anyone within a 5-mile radius. The script really doesn't help matters either. I think after the darker elements of the first film, a directional choice was made by someone in a high-up position to instead refocus the film to be more in line tonally with the 80s animated series. And as a result, that means that every 10 to 15 seconds or so, you get a stupid pun or an unfunny joke or a reference to pizza. I mean, this film's big penultimate fight scene is literally punctuated by burp jokes and vanilla ice. That's the tone we're working with here. The more emotional moments of the first movie, gone. There's an artificially emotional scene discussing the Turtles' origin story, but that's about it. The Turtles have lost any sense of humanity that was given to them in the first film. Here, they're cartoon characters, pretty much. Casey Jones, our male human hero from the first film, totally forgotten about in this one. Like, he doesn't even get written out, they just never talk about him. Which is odd considering April and him seem to have really hit it off at the end of the last movie. Splinter is pretty much resigned to appearing fleetingly in this, largely just to drop exposition and to punish the Turtles, and we have a new April O'Neil with Paige Turio replacing Judith Hoag. She's alright in this, but again she's pretty much pushed to the background. She's only really used to drop exposition and to act like a mothering figure to the Turtles. cleaning up after them and offering emotional support. All the dialogue is very basic in how it's written. It never feels like it's going to suddenly put out an interesting or creative message. And to make matters worse, there's padding in this film. And not like the kind of padding in the original that kinda suited the second act all is lost plot vibe. No, there are just scenes where Shredder goes and breaks stuff because he can. Also, I can't forgive this movie for Vanilla Ice. I just can't. The two New Mutants are just dull, honestly. They're largely placeholders for the generic super strong villain type. They could have literally just been two super strong henchmen and it would have worked just as well, considering how much they get to use their animal-based mutant skills. That's another thing that bothered me actually while I'm thinking about it. Shredder asks his henchmen to go and find two of the most vicious animals in the city so that he can mutate them into the New Mutants. And the best that he could find was a wolf, which is fine, that's pretty cool, and a snapping turtle. Now, bearing in mind that New York is full of cats, dogs, birds, rats, hundreds of insects that on a large scale would be horrifying to battle, he went for a snapping turtle. It's ridiculous. And that's the problem with this script. It leans too heavily on its animation counterpart, and as a result, it's just not as solid a piece of work as the first film was. I'm in two minds about the direction. On the one hand, if I'm judging it on how it's trying to present its script, it's doing everything very much right. The cast are hyperactive and comedic, the style and shot choices for each scene reflect what's going on, and it works with the comedy to try and get maximum return on the laughs. On the other hand, if you're judging this direction on its ability to be a good film, it falls short. It's just a bit on the generic side, and because it's giving its all to the comedy elements, which to me just weren't all that funny, it means it never really develops its own style and voice. It's just a bit flat and TV movie-y. The cinematography is also a bit of a step down too. Gone are the moody lighting shots and the emphasis of working with the shadows. Gone is the more creative shot compositions and experimentation with shot types. This is pretty much just doing what it needs to do and nothing more. I noticed maybe one or two interesting shot choices, but that's it. It's a touch on the generic side and the bare minimum of what was required. And I feel quite sad about that, because with a more interesting DOP on site, we may have ended up with a much prettier film. The fight scenes don't feel quite as tight either this time around. They seem to have widened in creativity but lowered their scope in this one. There are many more fight scenes in this movie and the use of props and creative fighting styles has improved, but at the same time they fight less people more often and they just don't seem as well shot this time round. I also have to say that in the original UK release of this film, the opening salami nunchuck scenes, along with any other scenes in this movie that may or may not use nunchucks, were removed. Yeah, you can thank the BBFC's terrified paranoia that kids were going to suddenly start exploding each other's heads with bits of wood on string for that one. Though mercifully, for the DVD release that I own, those scenes were put back in. The production design's taken a nosedive here as well, with the sewers getting a marked downgrade that was absolutely stunning to see. Seriously, it just looks like they're walking down a series of dirty corridors here, rather than the mossy, filthy, curved sewerage we'd seen in the first film. Quite a lot of the movie is shot out in the open, presumably to save money, and even some of the better sets like the abandoned subway station or the nightclub just feel a bit empty and lacking. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the Turtles outfit's got a redesign here as well, and, well, there's something wrong with their mouths. They're way too flappy, and they don't move how they physically should at times. I feel like they'd be in tremendous pain if they actually existed with some of the facial expressions that they pull in this film. That's not to say, however, that everything from a design perspective is bad. Shredder looks miles better than he did in the first film. He's much more in line with the cartoon series, which to me means he looks much better for it. I'm sorry for having such a downer about this movie. I really wanted to like it, but across the board I just found myself consistently going, this isn't terrible, but the first film did it better. And even worse, if I remove the first film from the equation entirely and start judging the film on its own merits purely, I start thinking, this is just a bad movie. The acting's another element that falls down for me. The Turtles seem to have been given a much more cartoony set of voices that border on the irritating. April and Splinter, two of the characters I most enjoyed from the last movie, are in this one minimally used. And instead of Casey, a character I felt developed nicely through the first film, to a point where I'd like to have seen more of him here, we have Ernie Reese Jr. as Keno, a pizza delivery boy who tries to help the Turtles and then spends most of the movie either hanging around with April or off-screen planning things. And this is his first, last, and only appearance in anything to do with the Ninja Turtles. He doesn't really leave much of an impression. However, Shredder's new persona as generic supervillain and later as Kevin Nash's Super Shredder is Brill. He's campy and very enjoyable to watch. So I suppose that's a positive here. The soundtrack isn't as memorable as last time, and to make matters worse, more often than not, it feels like there should be music playing when there isn't. And what music does play just sounds cheap and, at best, unmemorable. Now I'm going to try and end here on a positive, and it's a positive that I have with the script. So I'm taking that as a double header from a positivity standpoint. I really liked the ending of this movie, for one reason. It shows narrative progression. It actually makes the point of establishing that the characters have matured and grown over the last two films, with the final fight being a raised stakes version of the final fight from the first film. And whereas the Turtles weren't strong enough to take on Shredder in the first film, here they're shown that they've developed enough to be able to overcome their enemies for the first time significantly. And I appreciated that the movie ends with them having a brief glimpse of maturity about them. So either this movie decided to reward long-term viewers with a sense of active progression in this universe's iteration of the Turtles storyline, or the writer couldn't be bothered to rewatch the first film when it came to writing the sequel and he just thought this was a kind of cool ending. But I'm going to go with the former here because I like how that idea sits in my mind. And as I mentioned, I want to end this on a positive. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 was released on DVD in either 2001 or 2002. What research I can do on this movie's release schedule seems to suggest it was either of those 2 years, so apologies for the vagueness. My version of the movie specifically was a double pack release by 20th Century Fox in 2002 that contained the second and third movies on 2 discs. And they look pretty good here. They're not the best DVD could ever offer, but they're more than watchable with little to no print damage or colour damage. There's even a trailer included on this disc, though that is about it for extras. Yeah, it's a bit of a bare bones release really. As for Blu-ray releases, well, the US had one. There's nothing yet planned for the UK, but in all honesty, I'm not really in a rush to get my hands on this one, truth be told. Is this a bad movie? No, absolutely not. It's fine for what it is. But I can't deny that this is a significant step down when compared to the original movie. An almost across the board fall in standards and quality. I just felt sad really that this movie didn't maintain the quality of the first film. If you've got kids, they'll probably love this film. It's a proper kids movie at heart, and it's not trying to be anything else. Though nostalgia goggles aside, if you're any older than 15 years old, you may really struggle with this one.